Whoa.
So what do you girls do for fun?
Fun? Hello and welcome to Unsafe Space. Today is one of our live book clubs. This month we've been reading fiction, and we've been reading one of my favorite books, Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. I'm very excited to talk about this one today, and especially to hear from some of our community who maybe have read it for the first time, given that this has become a very popular book in the past year and a half. You would think. I think it's actually more of just the TV show based on the book has become popular. Anyway, welcome everybody. Who do we have? We've got Carter. We've got Keith. We've got Thomas St. Thomas and Alex. And we've got, is that Amy? Hello, Amy. And we've got, do you want to introduce yourself? I'm blanking.
I think Sagita's here and
Sagita.
Yeah, and Matt, right?
And maybe Cheeky.
I don't, there she is.
Yeah. Cheeky Mare.
There's Cheeky
Hi,
Mare.
guys.
Keri, I forgot about that book club intro. Have you guys been playing it? I was out the last book club.
Yeah, we've been using it. Beverly queued it up.
There's one we have that has a lost clip too. I should find that one. I
like both of them. So
and Cheeky Mare dropped off.
Cheeky Mare.
Okay.
So just a reminder, if it's your first time in book club and you're in the live discussion, we just ask when you're not speaking to please mute your microphone so we don't pick up any background noise. And an announcement just at the top for anyone who wants to join us next month, you can be on camera in the chat, or you can be in the chat over on YouTube and or Odyssey also. Does Odyssey have a live chat?
I think yes, it does.
I think it does. Next month, we are doing Thomas Sowell's Black Rednecks and White Liberals. So you can get started on that one now if you would like to join us. You can find out more info at unsafespace.com on the book club page. That's it. That's my announcement. What do you think of the book, Carter?
Okay, I'll start with this. I think this woman has a mastery of the English language that is something I haven't seen in almost any other literature. Her command of the English language is amazing. And that I really enjoy how she can turn a phrase, and her use of vocabulary and nuance, and just the poetry of it is
Poetry,
very
right?
impressive.
Yes, I think so.
So I would say that was the positive thing that struck me the most about the book was that I was just like, wow, it's kind of like reading poetry at times. So I kudos to Margaret Atwood for that. That was really cool. I personally also felt like, oh, I can see why it's a chick flick. Like I can see why this is a chick book. Like I certainly found it a little bit melodramatic at times and was like, okay, I get it. There's lots of metaphor and your heart feels a certain way and we get how you feel and thank you for emoting all over the page. But it was done beautifully, so I can appreciate it. I expected it to be about Islam, but it wasn't. It was about Christianity. It was just not mainstream Christianity. And I have no reference about the book or about the TV show, so I don't know how different it was or not because I don't know anything about the television show. I will say I came away thinking to myself, yes, this is the boogeyman. This is the boogeyman that the feminists from the 80s were concerned of wrongly. And I guess this is the dystopia they were concerned about, right? And they were wrong about that being the dystopia. But it was still a good book.
Just a note on that about Islam. So she has said in interviews that she looked at Islam, radical Islam, as an example. And she tried to imagine what a religious fundamentalism taking root in the government might look like in the West. And this was her prediction. And I think she didn't see it was going to come from the left. instead of the right.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
I got the impression that like because she also, I looked after this, I expected it to be about Islam, so I looked up some stuff she said, and she was like, well, it's more about power than religion. That's the point. This was more about them using religion for power purposes. Um, but again, I can't help coming away going, yeah, I feminists, I know that that's always been your boogeyman. You were like, yeah, the patriarchy was a problem, but it was never as big of a problem as you said it was, and it was waning by the time you were whining about it in the 80s, and this was not the battle to be fighting, right? Like, stop being dramatic about how men are horrible and you need to fight the patriarchy. Like, that, it went the other way. That's not who we're fighting, right? Like, we have a lack of masculinity. The patriarchy was destroyed. They like more than destroyed. It was totally the wrong enemy. And I wonder what a book like hers would have been like in the 80s if she had had a different perspective on what the enemy will be, and what that would look like. Because I imagine that would have been chilling. But this was kind of like, I don't know. I felt like I was like reading a feminist nightmare that like I couldn't relate to, because I'm like, this isn't even a risk. So, but it was good. It's good.
Yeah.
And like I said, one of the best writers, like phenomenal writer.
She's one of my favorite writers. She's done a lot of books of poetry as well. And I was really fortunate at college. I got to take a whole course on her where it was my homework to get to read her. I think you're right. I think she's a poet in the way that she uses language and kind of the way she writes and jumps in through different time periods, but strings it all together and uses metaphor and will use references. Like, for example, there's one part in the book where she's talking about the chicken, and that she brings home a chicken and how one is like reaching their fingers inside and poking and pulling out the stuff inside the chicken. And later she's on a table much later, but she's being prodded like that chicken. And she doesn't even have to, she's so subtle with the language. She doesn't have to say, like the chicken that Cora was, your mind flashes back to that because of how good she is with it. But anyway, what other people, I know there are mixed opinions in this group, which I think is fantastic. Anybody else have a first impression?
I can give mine. Like both of you said, it made me feel like an idiot anytime I wrote anything after reading what she wrote, because everything she wrote was just so clean. I think as James Baldwin says, every sentence you write should be as clean as a bone. And that's how I felt reading what she wrote. There's never any word like confusing faith with confidence. Nothing ever came out that was.
I'm never going to live this argument down, Thomas.
No.
Am I?
There's never anything that I read where I was like, well, what exactly does she mean? Even when she's using all of these analogies, etc., it was perfectly clear. There's no confusion. You know exactly what she's saying, and it was so easy to read. I didn't imagine that I would have so much fun reading this as I did. But one of the things that I differ on with your interpretation, Carter, well, maybe not interpretation, but when I was reading it, I wasn't concerned about this is the way that they think the patriarchy should be fought because this is the danger of what might happen. What I kept seeing was parallels between every single other dystopia. This was just her version of the problems that are inherent to human nature. So, and it also reminded me of 1984 in the sense that I remember early on during the Trump administration when people said, oh, when he said something about fake news, and everyone started going, oh, no, see, it's 1984. This is what's going on. You guys should read that book because 1984, oh, my God. And I kept thinking, 1984 isn't what you think it is. Then as I'm reading this book, and I know the popular memes about what people seem to think this book is about, I was like, this is nothing like what you think it's about. And you keep using this book against people or against ideas, but it's your idea that this book is speaking to me against. So they've got almost all the same things, to where it's not necessarily men as a whole oppressing women. It's like every single other dystopia where it's one small, powerful group of people who are oppressing every other person. So they have the classes, just like in 1984, where you have the inner party, the party, the inner party, the outer party, whatever it was, and the proletariat. Same thing with Handmaid's Tale. You have the commanders and their wives, and then you have everybody else who is clamoring just to have a relationship, much less have sex or progeny. And they have all their different outfits based on their class. Every single dystopia that I keep seeing is always about concentration of power. They use different things, like this one used the falling amount of fertility to then say, oh, well, for your own good and for the survival of humanity, this is what we need to do. Oh, well, there's a pandemic, so we have to ratchet up all this stuff. Oh, you know what? There's wars with all those other people. And that's another thing. It was the same thing with the wars in 1984, where they were constantly fighting other people. So they were all focused on an outer threat, which I think is something that brings humans together all the time. Handmaid's Tale, same thing. They call them the angels at the front line. And they probably needed to have some kind of people at the front line, just like they did in 1984, because not only are they fighting these wars, but if you have all these men who aren't even allowed to have sex, much less have children, you have all this pent up testosterone and aggression. So you got to focus it somewhere. So, I didn't really get too much of the whole feminists are kind of saying this kind of thing. To me, it was just another dystopia, but a different version of dystopia.
I love that. Yeah. I think let somebody else speak about their opinions, and then I want to get into some of those parallels with other dystopias, I think.
I would agree with Thomas there, and not at all with you, Carter. I didn't feel like it was a feminist tract at all. I didn't feel as a man I was being hammered by it. Yes, it was utterly beautiful writing, but just like Thomas, you were saying, it was any dystopia anywhere. That was the issue. That was what you were staring down the barrel of. You could have swapped out any of the parts, any of the religious ideologies or whatever. If it was just about one set of people controlling the fertility and reproductive functions of women, it would have been essentially the same story. And there were, to my mind, loads of nuggets where the men were kind of given not a free pass, but they weren't demonized. The only males demonized were specific males for their specific behaviors. It wasn't like all men are evil. And even Offred, she, in talking with Moira, she was challenging her on her more extreme feminist views, and not agreeing with her even in the position where she's been used as a broodmare, essentially. So that was my first take. Anyway.
I just want to clarify something, because you're just making me realize it. I did not come away with man-hating from the book. That wasn't the 80s feminism that I felt about it. It was women victimhood. It was very much like women are victims of everything all the time. There were a few, Aunt Lydia, maybe she was not viewed as a victim as often as other characters, but that's what I mean when and maybe it's my lived experience in high school in the 80s, right? But there was in high school in the 80s, there was a huge feminist contingent of girls my age running around being victims of everything and writing poetry about how victimized they were by literally everything. And there was an element of that to this for me, although I do agree with both of you that it could have been you could have replaced it with other stuff and still had a dystopia, but it could have been some other dynamic. So I think those dystopian elements were there. I agree with that. It's just that particular thing. I kind of wish that she hadn't used that particular boogeyman. That's all.
So I'll do one for Camp Carter because I saw it that way, exactly what you said. I probably wouldn't have been able to articulate it the way you did. But if she was trying to be prescient about, the big boogeyman, I think like technocracy would have been maybe a better choice. So, in the 80s, 90s and on, we have all this technology and, all the women working in camps, those who were infertile, doing manual labor. It's just kind of didn't add up for me with all the new technologies coming along. And I thought like technocracy would have been a better choice. But then again, it's her choice. She's the author. And I love the book and the writing. Absolutely. It was beautiful. But, if she's trying to be prescient, like the shrouded women, and like you could see parallels with other societies, but I didn't quite, that part was not convincing to me personally.
I'll go if you want.
Who else?
My context, I listened to the Audible version. I didn't read it, which was really done well. The reader was excellent. I agree with what you're saying about the wording. Like, I didn't really get that much into the story, but it was written so well. It reminded me of like reading Henry David Thoreau or something. She's really good. Like, yeah, you can tell exactly what's going on. So I really liked that. I enjoyed that part. I did it in 4 days on Audible, which I don't usually get through a book that fast. So it had kind of a lot of impact. But the scenario itself to me seems so far outside of what I think could really happen that it didn't impact me the way like 1984 or Fahrenheit 451 did as a dystopia. It's like, I don't think this can really happen. So I understood the concerns part, but it's almost like over the top. Not that Fahrenheit 451 isn't over the top too, but I didn't see it as impactful to me. Is that I like she had the war like George Orwell does. Like, okay, there's a war, but it's not actually clear if all that's bullshit, if it's really happening or not. Like, that's the same thing. Like, to get people to live in that kind of society, that's a common thread in this dystopia. You got to have a war ongoing all the time. That's what politicians do. That's how they get that kind of control. I liked how she had like people weren't allowed to read the Bible. Like, she's not allowed to read a book, and the Bible they keep locked up, and they can't even verify a quote. Like, one of them I remember was she said, "Well, it says in the Bible, from each woman according to her ability, to each man according to his need." That's in the Bible.
Yeah.
Like, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Mix. They're mixing.
Yeah.
They're mixing.
That was a good mix.
Yeah, that one. Another great quote. I've already used it like 2 or 3 times in arguing with people online. And I think Carter mentioned this one on the show, and it struck me when she says, I'm paraphrasing a little, but she says, there's a difference between ignorance and ignoring. Ignoring takes work. Like, that's a great one.
Yeah.
So I really enjoyed the writing. Could the future really look like that? I don't think religion, Christianity is, mixed with government is going this way. It's actually the opposite. Christianity is getting less and less influence in government, for good or for better, better or for worse. I don't think this could happen. I don't think in the 80s, I would not have thought this could really happen. People won't let any place in America get this far. It's worse than the Puritans, after the Mayflower, I don't think it could really happen. So it didn't strike me the way some other dystopias, but I did enjoy it. I'm glad I read it. And I never saw the TV show. I didn't know anything about it. I didn't even know what the subject was. So I went through it completely open, other than hearing a few snippets. So everything I have heard in the past about it was completely and totally wrong. Had nothing to do with the book.
Yeah. I was comparing it to you mentioned 1984 and Fahrenheit 451. I was comparing it in my mind to Brave New World in 1984, because those are the 2 dystopian novels that we've read recently. And I think you're kind of hitting on the key for me. It was the tools that she viewed the authoritarians using to get power weren't the right tools. Like, I read 1984 and I go, yes, a surveillance state. Absolutely. Like newspeak. Absolutely. That's where like surveillance state, newspeak, got all that. Totally see that happening. I see Brave New World, and I'm like, oh, a drug that makes people kind of zone out. Oh, the normalization or trivialization of sexual activity. Like, oh yeah, like I kind of see that. Oh, the indoctrination of children while they're sleeping. Yep, got all that. That's all there. And I look at this book and I'm like, those aren't the tools that the people are going to use. Those tools aren't the tools that will resonate with the population. Like that's not the direction that the culture was going, where they would allow, like you're saying, they wouldn't go that way. They wouldn't allow it to go that way. It wouldn't be a useful tool. A patriarchy that's prudish or kind of weird. But I do like that she had the people at the top having some hypocrisy, and you see this in a lot of these dystopian books where like the ruling class doesn't follow their own rules. They've got like, and in this one, they've got their hookers and whatever their parties are.
Their Scrabble parties.
Yeah, their Scrabble parties.
I want to let everyone else give their first impressions, but I have to jump on that for a second. I have to, because I agree with you. And I think I said this when it's her version, the feminist nightmare of how dystopia takes place. I think I agree with everyone who's talked so far anyway, in different ways. The feminist idea of what a dystopia will look like in the Western world did not come to pass. Do I think in the 80s that some feminists looked at the culture and the culture of, the religious fundamentalists on the right had a lot of sway in the 80s and 90s. And I think they looked at things like Jerry Falwell and they looked at these figures and said, oh my gosh, it's going to be this nightmare where they take over the government and they want to force us to be handmaidens like in the Bible. And they thought this could come to pass. And maybe at that time in the 80s and 90s, this seemed like it was more of a realistic possibility of what dystopia might look like. But I think now it's so off the mark that fundamentalism didn't end up coming, at least the fundamentalism bleeding into the government and being used to gain power, political power, and to oppress people, didn't come from the religious right. It came from the religious left. And I, when that comes to the pandemic, COVID, when it comes to wokeism and so when they decided to make this into a TV show, it's almost as if they just thumb their nose. It's what we've talked about on the show a lot. They're living in this false reality, these two different movies playing on screen. And I think they read this book, or most of them don't even read it. They just watch the interpretation of the show. But the people that made the show read this book and they really look out at the world and say, wow, we're so close to this now. Like, look at all the conservative Republican, white supremacist heteropatriarchy, and they really think we're close to this now. For anyone who hasn't watched it, the TV show the first season ends with the book ends. So she gets in the car, you don't know what's going to happen, if she's being saved or not. Then they come back with like a season 2 and 3, and I don't know, I think 4 now, I don't know. And I quit watching after season 2 because at that point you've just got the social justice writers. They're not even guided by this anymore. They're just writing it based on what the world they want us to believe exists. This writing patriarchy that we're currently living in, and they're hammering you over. It has none of the poetry of this book. It has none of the insight. Like they're just hammering. They're hammering us over the head with, "This is the world we're living in. Isn't it awful?" So.
Keri, it's interesting because you're reminding me that it's kind of like Marcuse's repressive tolerance essay, in the sense that she's, as a feminist, she's writing in the 80s saying that, she's worried about the threat coming from the religious right and doing all this stuff. And the threat that she's worried about, people exploiting zealotry to maintain or to obtain power, is correct in that sense. But it came from actually the feminists. Like, it grew out of that leftist feminism. And just like Marcuse has in repressive tolerance, this idea that, like, well, the cathedral, he doesn't use the term cathedral, obviously, but like he has this idea that the cathedral is controlled by the right, basically. And so the left is the ones that are being oppressed and they need to, but like actually the opposite what was the true. Oh, it was the truth.
And see, Margaret Atwood, one quick note, does everybody remember the part in the book where she's talking about her mom? She's remembering in the past going to a protest with her mom with all these feminists who are burning pornography. They're burning books. Okay, so Margaret Atwood isn't this, she's not easily, at least until recently, she hasn't been easily shoehorned into woke or not. And even in this book, she's recognizing, look, the censorship, the book burners, some of the book burners were the feminists, were people on the left in this book. And they weren't all just like this culture didn't arrive. It wasn't just right fundamentalists took over. It was the culture was moving in this direction, and that allowed for this religious sect to take over. And nowadays they would never include something like that where there's any kind of culpability on the part of the left and wanting to censor, and which is exactly what's happening. I'm sorry, I'm talking too much. I want Amy and Alex to say what they think of the book.
I guess I'll go. I know Alex was not a fan. I really, first of all, we stole this book for our knitters. We have a sub book club that we pilfered with our knitters, and we chose to read this. And I will say, in our discussions of it, one of our members was particularly moved and like really shook by this book. Now she happens to be a doula, so that may, if you don't know what a doula is, that may have to do with her effect of it, but she was really moved by it. I read it first, I think in like 2016, because, they kept saying, this is what we're going to be like. And I'm reading it, I'm going, I really don't understand. You really, really don't understand. This is not what this book is about. So in rereading it, I caught way more of the religious aspects, I think, that I missed the first time. So many little tidbits that if you're not a Christian, or have biblical knowledge, you might not have caught. The references to sons of Ham and all these things that she had reference to that I really did, which bothered me in the TV show. I'm like, they were all white. They would have all been white, because if you read the book, it clearly said they got shunned everybody who was a different color. But I definitely, I'm not going to say I could see this happening. I could see how someone could see this happens, that a society gets so ridiculous that a pseudo Christianity needs to come in and save everything and make everything okay again, which in turn they do not, of course, because they're human and they get it wrong every time. But I definitely saw it. I read it more from a religious aspect than the feminine. I didn't get the feminist. I didn't see the man hating either. I agree with everybody so far, but I definitely read it more in tune to the religious little things she would drop in, the references. And I was like, oh, okay. I mean, the misquoting of the scripture, I'm like, that's not what that says. That's what would get me.
Could you see how, did you come away from this seeing like, oh, I could see how Alyssa Milano would think that this is what's happening? Like I looked at this and like, oh, if you're one of those crazy people on the left, like I can totally see why this is the book that you would want to make a show out of.
I mean, I could see how, because they have no true understanding of what she was trying to say or any true understanding of the whole point. So yeah, I could see how they're like, oh, this is how it's going to be. And I mean, again, I just don't see how they could say that. I don't know. I just don't get it as a full-on feminist. Yeah, I don't see how in the 80s it would have been, full-on
if they
feminist.
If they made 1984 into a TV show, they would do the same thing they did with Handmaid.
Right.
They would make it the evil Trumpian right-wing insurrectionists have come in and they're doing your 5 minutes of hate, and they put up a Muslim woman because they're such bigots. They want us to all focus our hate on the they would just, and
instead of 2 plus 2 is 5, it would be COVID. COVID isn't the most deadly thing ever. Vaccines are questionable. Yeah. All right, Alex, lay it on us.
Okay, so I read this for the first time in 2019. for a book club, and I immediately read the Testaments after that, because we were actually reading the Testaments, not The Handmaid's Tale. And so that was my first time, and I went through grad school in creative writing, so I probably could have maybe run into it then, but I didn't. And after reading 3 Atwood novels, I found her language tedious and boring. And to be not in a row, I didn't read them in a row, okay? To be fair, like there was time between the first book I read and the second book I read, because I read the first book, Lady Oracle, in grad school for a Gothic literature course. But my problem with her language that I found was that almost all of her characters are consciously choosing the language that is being depicted. So, like, for example, this is a historical record that the handmaid is actually picking these words. And the same is kind of true in the Testaments, and the same is kind of true in Lady Oracle, that she's consciously picking the words. So I found that her language had nothing to do with the characters themselves. They were all about her showing off her skills as a writer, and that kind of bothered me. And then because I feel like that's not really good writing. If it's first person, if they're literally consciously choosing their words, then they have to be different. They cannot be the same. Their language was too just Margaret Atwood, essentially. And then on top of that, I really can't stand the idea that this could happen, like that she could even conceive of it as happening, because, and I feel that way about most dystopias, but the reason why is because, one thing, we have firearms, and the other one is that the First Amendment is partially, built on the idea that we all have different religious beliefs. So I'm sort of like, how do you create a theocracy at that point? Like, you can't, like, and I know they disrupted the Constitution or whatever, but I just don't feel like it really, like, that she did the work to make it happen, from a cultural standpoint. And
she glosses over how it would have gotten to that state.
Right.
Kind of,
yeah, she does. She definitely does. I don't feel like it was earned at all. Now, comparing it to 1984 and Brave New World, Brave New World feels more realistic, but 1984 and Fahrenheit 451, the language is sort of removed. It feels almost ethereal. So the weirdness of those dystopias are more like removed from disbelief for me, versus The Handmaid's Tale, which is far too direct, and it's a historical document even. So to me, it's too human to have that kind of like, this is an idea, story. So that's one of the reasons why I didn't like it.
Can we talk about the historical document thing? Because I think that's a weird choice she made. Does anyone have an opinion about that?
Can you explain
I thought it was interesting. I was going to ask Keri or somebody who's seen the TV show, did the TV show have that? Because you said the TV show started where the book leaves off, but there's another whole long section. It doesn't have the whole historical reference where they talk about this happened in Maine, and
no, but
and I'll summarize it.
They show you what happens outside of Gilead in the TV show. They show you what happens.
So to answer Thomas's question, because I want to make sure everybody understands what she means by historical document. There at the end of the book, in case people didn't think it was a part of the book, if they thought it was just notes, it's a part of the book. It's historical notes on The Handmaid's Tale. That's part of the book. And it's basically this professor who years in the future is saying, we found this, kind of like finding Anne Frank's diary. We found this book or these audio cassettes of it's one handmaid who recounted her tale. And so they kind of set that the whole book was actually recorded by her, and it's a historical document in the future that they're examining to get an idea of what like life was like in Gilead.
They talk about the Underground Women's Railway, and they theorize that she escaped into Canada on the railway and then made it to England, and they debate whether or not the tapes, the Quakers helped her. It was interesting. I like that whole part. And I thought the same thing. I started listening to it and like, am I even supposed to listen to this? What is this? and
Yeah.
I like had to get my phone out to see if like Audible put me into another book.
It's like
That's
in
when I
Screw
first-
Tape Letters when I did whatever version I had didn't have that thing at the end that everybody else had read, and I was like, "What are they talking about?" Like,
But I like that, and it was a long thing, and it was done as a speech at a historical convention, like hundreds of years later, that's the only place that the book covers what Alex brought up or Carter brought up about how did this happen. Like that's where they explain. You know, it wasn't super believable, but that's when they started about how society went into this Gilead, and then you find out that actually the rest of the world, including like Canada, wasn't even part of this, and they were helping fight it. And it happened in Maine. I've been to Maine. I don't think this can happen in Maine, but it was interesting, and it helped me understand what she really meant by and why it was written that way as a first person recorded account. I do agree with what Alex said, because after I listened to that, I thought the first person account had to be by a handmaid who's like a brilliant writer and knows exactly what's going on, yet she's going along with it all. And why did everybody go along with it? I also didn't understand how the you say about the TV show, they blame everything on the men. It is actually more like the feminists cause it, right? The ladies in the school were more in charge, and it seemed to me the men were in this are just going along. They're like, oh, this is cool, sure. They're just going along with it. It's like the women are actually in charge in the book.
So two things he talks about in the historical notes, that in this totalitarian society, like they recognized that they had to get the women to control the women. That no totalitarian society has ever advanced without having members of a group control their own group. I thought that was interesting. The other thing is that they about the Constitution, I did think that part was believable, even though she doesn't go through the details of how they actually execute this coup. It's just like, yeah, Congress is gunned down, the president's gunned down, then it's happened. But some of the slow details, and I saw Amy, you were pulling some of these out and putting them in the Facebook group. The details like where like the ignoring takes work, like you talked about, Carter. Sort of they just started ignoring because everything was at a slow boil. And she says something about being boiled in a bathtub slowly. And they said, we have to suspend the Constitution, but it's just temporary. And that's like, I'm one of those people who believe the lockdowns were temporary. I was so ignorant, and we just kind of keep existing and keep going because it's slowly. It's like, well, this is just temporary. It's going to come back. And then the way that her bank cards, that stuck with me from, I first read this book when I was 15 or 16. And that was before the cards were ubiquitous, I think. And so later on, it occurred to me, once we were becoming of more digital currency, not digital currency, but using cards for things instead of cash, it always brought this book back to mind. The idea that I might go to the supermarket one day and my card may not work. And we've seen that happening around us. We've seen Joe Biggs and other people on the right, their banks just decide, sorry, you can't bank with us anymore. Or YouTube decides certain creators, we're not, or PayPal's like, we're not gonna, that could happen slowly. So some of these things I think I agree. There's parts that she kind of is hazy with the details and how would that actually work. But then other parts, I thought that's a great understanding of human nature, that we sort of go along slowly and we just keep existing. And then she gets in a relationship with Nick and she's almost, that's enough. It's like, well, I have this thing now that allows me to tolerate living this life, this one bit of joy. And we become, I think in a totalitarian society, we become easily placated. We become easily like, give me the bread and circus and I'm fine. And I'm not going to push back, because there was another part in the book like that too, where she was talking about why they did. Oh, when Moira escaped, right? And they're like, they said they feared, it was something like, we feared Moira. She was like an elevator with no walls, because we get so accustomed to our freedoms being taken away that for someone to rebel in that way, while we both idolized her, or they liked the fact that she existed, someone that broke the rules, they also were terrified of her because they had become so accustomed to the rules. That's a lot of talking on my part.
Yeah, for me, the frog in the pot thing is like, that's nice, but it doesn't explain that. That's not a sufficient explanation for the suspension of the Constitution and takeover. Like, I get the frog in the pot analogy. Obviously, it's old and everyone uses it, so like I get that, and there's some truth to that, but it still wasn't enough. For me, but I guess my big thing is about the end, about the historical notes part. I didn't actually like it. I didn't get anything out of the historical notes, and I was really curious about why she chose to include the historical notes, because it actually kind of ruined it for me. I wanted the story just to be over and leave me there, and then it was like it wasn't yeah, there was something discontinuous about it, and the insights weren't very useful, so it was kind of some references to things and poor explanations that were glossed over, because he was having a conversation, like he's giving a speech with people who already know the history, so just kind of make some comments about stuff, and like I didn't get anything out of that, and I kind of preferred that she just didn't have that.
I didn't read that part until this morning. I skipped it. I kind of skimmed through it. And even this morning when I read it, I couldn't read the whole thing. I felt similar. Like I didn't need it, but it was kind of interesting to have it there and get a little bit more insight on what happened and why. But I wanted to say something almost kind of in defense of Miss Atwood. When I think of what was going on during that time and why she was writing what she's writing here, you know, it makes me think that she's actually saying, hey, feminists, hey, buddies, let's be really careful what we wish for. And there's two instances in the book where she says something like this, where she has often talked about her mother, and now her mother is what we think of as a typical feminist. I mean, she was nice to her husband, her son-in-law, Luke. I think that was his name. And, you know, they had some banter back and forth, but she was, you know, the what we think of as a loud, strong, proud feminist. And then when thinking about her mother, she says something like, she got what she wanted. And does she know that this is what she wanted? And on two separate occasions, she talks about that, having this happen. And it's almost like this is what they asked for. And a lot of it was what the ants were teaching was things like, well, you know what? Remember how it used to be? You couldn't walk out in the street. You couldn't do this. You couldn't do that because men are really aggressive. Men are going to rape you. Men are going to beat you. And this is for your own safety. And we just went through, I haven't heard this much lately, but the whole rape culture thing. You know, men are like this, toxic masculinity. You have to be less feminine. Now, as Carter mentioned earlier, instead of men saying, oh, no, that sucks, go away, a lot of men have just said, okay, I'm going to be feminine. So it didn't actually go that way. But she's...
Wait, do that voice again for us, Thomas.
Okay, I'm going to be feminine.
Okay.
But it's almost like she was warning her buddies to say, hey, you know what? If we keep saying that we can't go out on our own, they're going to say, oh, okay, well, you can't go out on your own. It's too dangerous for you. So let's make sure we keep you safe. And this is in part them keeping them safe.
Yeah, she said at one point, my mom always wanted like a women's society or a women's culture, and now we have it.
I wanted to say something about what Alex was saying about the writing, which I do get. I understand what you're saying, but I feel like if you read it, I feel like Offred's writing it, or if you believe the historical, telling into audio cassette, because that kind of part too was a little because it's like, well, if she's telling it into an audio cassette, this is after the fact. She even says she glosses over some things. She doesn't want to say some things. She changes, you know, she retells the stories of how things happen in herself. But at the same time, is she really going to be quite that poetic about certain things when she's retelling the story? But then at other times, her story is very point blank, not very much bells and whistles. And she's pretty, you know, not as poetic about it. So yeah, is she really going to retell it that way differently in audio cassette? But I interpreted it not as her until I got to the end and I remembered the part about the historical tapes. I interpreted it as I'm reading it as she's like literally writing a diary, which I realize makes no sense because she's not supposed to have a diary when she can't write. But that's how I'm reading it in my head, is how she would be saying it in her head. So that sometimes when she's laying there at night and she's just staring at this medallion on the ceiling, she's waxing poetic. And other times she's laying there with the commander and she's, you know, thinking these things in her head. So I kind of interpreted the writing that way, that it was variable based on her mood and her experience of the day and whatever was going on. And it didn't really dawn on me about the audio part until like literally just now. Like that doesn't make sense why she would have.
Because she wasn't recording
That
it
is one of my
extemporaneously,
points.
right?
Right.
Yeah.
She wasn't recording at the
points in my
time things were
review.
happening. Yeah, she was recording it afterwards. So why was she really, really poetic and really, really passionate about certain parts and then just gloss over these parts? But again, to the part about, I feel like one of the reasons Atwood doesn't give you a whole lot of information about what happens is so your imagination can run wild about how these things happen. But she also kind of paints her as not, I mean, she's a data entry clerk kind of thing. She goes to college. She, you know, has a relationship with a married man. You know, she
wasn't a poet prior to this, right?
Yeah,
it's
she
not
doesn't
like
build her
yes,
as
right.
this highly intellectual, highly, you know, fulfilled person. So I think that that's a good explanation for how it happens. As you get distracted with you're not going to pay attention if it doesn't matter to you. So it's not until she realizes, hey, I can't go shopping and I can't use my card. I can only use Luke's card. And that's weird. Meanwhile, Maura has been trying to tell her this for however long. So I
did like that Moira was like, I did like the "I told you so" aspect of Moira a little bit.
Her.
Like
I really like her
because I know there's a lot of people now that kind of relate to Moira. Like, we told you this was happening. Like, it wasn't going to be a temporary lockdown. Like,
right.
Yeah, guys, we told you this. And Moira kind of rolls with it. But I want to, Alex. By the way, I want you to comment on this, because one of the things I love about Alex, just everyone who's not heard her, like I never know what the hell she's going to think about a book. So I did not expect this from you. But I will say, I did view the writing as indulgent. Like Atwood is clearly in love with language. She clearly is a master she's a wordsmith. She's a master wordsmith. She's poetic. I didn't know she had written books of poetry, but that makes sense. I viewed this as very indulgent writing from her perspective. And I could see if, like Alex, I read 3 books and I was like this, and it was like, all right, I'm kind of tired of your self-indulgence, Margaret. Like, it was cool. Like, I got it, but I'm kind of over it. And I explained this. I explained this to my wife a little bit, and she said, "Oh, I loved that language when I was in high school, but like, I'm over it now." So, Alex, did you feel like she was indulgent? Is that what it was?
Yeah, she's incredibly like, look at how awesome I am with language. And it's okay to do that. It kind of reminds me of bebop jazz or heavy metal, where they're like, look how many notes I can play, how quickly and precisely. And you're like, yeah, good, but it's not a good song. You know, like, because the problem is that she's sacrificing actual character building through the language to show off. And I'm not okay with that. Like, you can still be poetic and be true to your character that you're trying to present. And you can be as self-indulgent as you want to be in poetry, that it pretty much is. And also it's sustainable in such a short amount of words. But it is not, to me, sustainable from the perspective of writing a novel. And especially a novel that's supposed to be first person, and not just first person, but person composed. So I find it really
on audio tapes.
Yeah, on audio tape. Like, from the perspective of how we think, it just doesn't make any sense. There's so many points where she's like temporarily close as she's telling this, but that's not possible because she's recording it at long after the fact. And then there are points where she does this thing. It's there's a short story she wrote called Happy Endings, where there's all these different scenarios that come out different ways. And that's basically what she did with the sex scene with Nick, and I was like, that's not really how it happened. Actually, it happened like this. And then she does it, and I'm like, okay at that point, but then she does it a third time. She does it again. That's not really how it happened. And I'm like, okay, now you're just lying to me, and I'm pissed.
That's not how it happened either. It's like,
you can't keep doing that to your reader, because then I'm like, I'm wasting my time. Now I don't believe anything you told me. You could be totally lying about everything you said because you want to, I don't know, work out your psychological problems, and that's fine, but it's not good for your plot.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't go with audio recording idea. She could have written a diary afterward, not a diary, but like the account of things that happened to her and gotten all poetic about it. But as an audio diary, no way it could have happened.
Yeah, I would have found it much more believable if it was a written manuscript, like a written memoir that was discovered later. Because then I could have thought, well, she edited this and like spent time writing it the way she wanted to write it. Okay.
So none of this bothered me. And I guess I like beautiful writing. I like to fall into it and get hooked by a book where, like, you get hooked by a song where you can't stop reading it. And it also didn't affect I felt like I know this character very well because it's like reading her inner thoughts. And the way that she writes, like, it happened like this. No, it happened like this is, I think it's almost like reading a journal where you're reinterpreting it. You're sort of like, this is what happened in this scenario, or am I reading, or let me tell it in this way from the other person's point of view, kind of thing. I don't know. I like that. None of that bothered me.
Yeah, I like that too.
However, I don't think at the end, the fact that she like tacked on the thing about it being a historical document, I agree. It would have been better without that, because then you're not even wondering, did she record it? What are the mechanics of how this story was written down? Then you're not even wondering, because there's numerous stories where you're just in the character's head and you don't know how or why. There's numerous stories where you're in the and it doesn't tell you at the end. This is an audiobook, like you don't have to grapple with that question. You're just magically in the head. And so I think it would have been better if it didn't give you that kind of like, this character dictated this into tape recorder, so you have to think about that. I think the reason why she did that, and I'll finish here on this point, was I think she did that because, and I wish she hadn't, but I think she was trying to say, like, this is how cold and removed it is down the road, all these hundreds of years later, like some lecturers coming in and telling you about this, and this is just, it's all the personality is removed. There's this cold clinical explanation of this very personal journal. And
they laugh at things in a way they're
laughing. And at the end, he's like, any questions? And it's like this, you just sort of the distance that history provides. Now that it's something in the past that you can just look at it clinically, this very personal, and like looking at something like Anne Frank and saying, here's this very personal story that you can read of this little girl keeping a journal of what it was actually like. Or here's this very clinical, removed historical interpretation, of what things were. I don't know. I think that's probably why she did it, but I agree. I think it would have been better without it. That's a long ramble.
I thought a little bit, or I wondered anyway, if it's either an accidental or on purpose excuse, like Margaret Atwood puts that stuff at the end to explain why there are disjointed things. Like, one of the things she says is they didn't actually know which order the tapes were in, and they had to guess, and some of them are probably out of order. And a whole bunch of other things related to that. Like, it explains why she doesn't really say how this really happened, or could it really happen, or exactly where it is. It's like an excuse in a way. She doesn't have to fully develop the story because of that, because it's a hundreds of years later professor analyzing these tapes that they found. They don't really know why. And it also explains why there's only the one character. And maybe that's Margaret Atwood. It's not really her character, like Alex said. But she doesn't develop any other characters, really. You don't really know very much about them. And she doesn't have to because of the format. It's sort of an excuse, I think.
See, but I think it's more terrifying to not know. for her to leave out all these details. That lets your imagination wonder, how did they get to this point? And I think that's much more interesting than if they gave you all the answers, because I think that's more of the lesson, is that, hey, why don't you sit here and think about how this could happen and if it could happen, and what are you going to do about it if it does? So I like that it's not all spelled out for you. I don't want to know, you know.
When it's left open like that, though, I think of how that fails, because so many people in the US, even back in the 80s, owned firearms. And I got into an argument with another child-free woman about this, which is kind of funny. But we were like, I said people would fight against this. And she was like, oh, people don't fight because they've got kids. And I was like, what? I'm pretty sure that's why a lot of people fight, is because they have kids, that they don't want a future like this for their children. So I was like, I mean, isn't that what was that Mel Gibson movie? I've never, The Patriot? I'm pretty sure, like, there's so many stories about people going off to war or fighting something because they want a better future for their children. So I'm sort of like I see Americans especially as people who would fight this. Like,
Well,
even Christian people would fight this, I would think.
I think it's interesting you brought up the Patriot, because as you were saying that, I was thinking it can go both ways having kids. There's going to be people that are going to be Jimmy Carters and think that, well, if I just keep accommodating, I'm going to be safer. I'm doing this for my kids. I'm keeping them safe, because even if they're living in a dystopia, at least they're alive. And even in the Patriot up front, it was because he was a father that he didn't want to go fight, because he thought he had more of an obligation to his kids. And it wasn't until his son was actually murdered that he went into the fight. So did he start fighting for patriotism, or did he start fighting for revenge?
It's what you're bringing up. It's part of why I said, like, I don't know why she picked Maine. That just seems ludicrous. It's like picking Texas for this to happen. Like, how about New York City or something? Like, there's counties in Maine that are bigger than Massachusetts, you know, like, and you think you're going to go in there and do this? And there's a shotgun behind every door, and grandmother sitting there knitting is perfectly capable of picking up that shotgun. Like, I don't think it could happen there. I don't think it'd happen in America anyway, but maybe you think she's never been to Maine.
Well, I think Carter's mentioned this before, where I'm not always confident that all these people who talk about the Second Amendment and even own firearms are actually going to pick up and do something. It's very different when it's like, all right, somebody's here telling you stuff. It's not like they're getting shot at, you shot back. It's very different to actually stand up and start saying, you know what, if you cross this line, I'm just going to start shooting, especially when you have your kids downstairs. So, you know, I can imagine that people think that, oh, you know what, I've got all these weapons and we're going to do all this. Maybe you will, maybe you won't. And I'm sure it takes a certain amount of people to do it. But I'm not always confident that it's going to happen that way.
Yeah, I think you would probably try to escape, right? You would try, like, I would want to escape to Canada with my kids, but that escape would be an armed escape. And if it wasn't working out and it had to be shoot my way through the border and hope I live, that's how that would go, probably, right?
Yeah,
but
I'll stand at the border while you kids run. I hope I'll meet you later. I'm sorry if I don't.
Right.
The attitude you hear a lot of people like, it'll never happen here, you know, blah, blah, blah. Like, yeah, what Thomas is saying is true. If they start coming around, people have met my girlfriend, like, she lived in South Africa through this whole exact process where everybody had guns. And when Mandela took over, the police went around and got all the guns. Guess what? You know, when like 10 cops show up and, you know, are willing to, they'll do something like tie down the woman and rape her and then kill the father if you don't give them the guns. Almost everybody gives up their guns. That's what happens. Unless people get together in a group, you have no chance against the state if they decide to do that. That could happen. I just think Maine's an unlikely place. It's easier to happen in a city.
Well, and I would think as that started to happen, you would start to have people develop groups. Like, if people started to see this is what they're doing now everywhere, like, you would start to have immediately groups would congeal of like, all right, like, because, and one person can't fight the entire sheriff's department in your local county, but 20 of you can.
Yeah,
Possibly,
I
right?
think it would be hard. And the ratio of people is different there than here, but I've heard stories about how that happened. And yeah, like people say, like, it could never happen here. Like, don't be so sure. As Thomas pointed out, don't be so sure that you wouldn't willingly give up, that a lot of people wouldn't willingly
I
give up
agree.
their
I just think
firearms.
that would have to be covered in the book. That like it would be a rougher transition. Like I agree, it could happen, but it couldn't happen in such a way that you could skip over it in a historical account of what, like, it wouldn't just bang, we're here. It would have been, oh, there was a really rough patch where there was lots of fighting and this happened and that happened, or they went from door to door and did this, and some people, like, it would be, there would be more agitation. There wouldn't just be like, we shot Congress and now guys with guns that we're not sure if they're the military or not are in charge. Oh, well.
Hey, Matt.
And she
I
skipped
just
all
wanted
that
to
in the
make
book,
sure
which
Matt
made
gets
it
to,
less realistic. Go ahead.
I just want to make sure Matt gets to say something because I think he was trying to say something and he's on a lag.
Sorry about that. Yeah, it was about the plausibility of the plot devices. I mean, it's either speculative fiction or science fiction, depending on your view, and nothing dates those genres more quickly than being very precise about near future events. Because I mean, even if we look back just 30 years to the 80s, you know, it's such a radically different landscape than we have now. But in so many ways, it's exactly the same. So it seemed to me that she was more looking to soft focus a number of elements so she could get to the parts of the story that she was more keen to express. How you get there is less important. And as I was trying to suggest before about, you know, it didn't have to be Christianity, it didn't have to be Maine. Just the fact that there is a totalitarian state that wants to own the reproductive faculties of women. That is the important part of it. And it's the division along sex lines that seemed important. So, you know, if everyone stands up and has the last gunfight of the OK Corral or whatever, is somewhat, it doesn't advance the story she's trying to tell. And you know, the specifics about how they took over the government and shut down the society are not as important as the aftermath. Offred is the aftermath, basically. So for me, that it didn't bother me in the slightest. I've read some science fiction and speculative fiction where you've just gone, seriously, you went into so much detail there, and now it's already dated beyond question. And as a corollary to that, men tend to write hard sci-fi. They explain all the details. They explain how it happens and all the made-up physics and whatever. Female sci-fi and speculative fiction, often, in my experience, tends to be split along the same, you know, things for men, relationships for women. And so that is more how I perceive the Handmaid's Tale as being an efficient story. She told the softer elements, which I liked definitely, and I didn't feel that the end sequence detracted too much from it. And my biggest takeaway from that section was totalitarian states do not last; they fall. It might take a couple of 100 years, but they fall, and then they become curiosities which will be studied for time immemorial, and we will never let this happen again until, of course, it does.
Do you think it took away from the impact of, like, sometimes when you write a dystopian novel like this, part of your goal is to warn people to behave in a certain way or not let this thing happen? Do you think it lessens the impact a little bit when you see at the end of the book, actually everything went back to normal, so it was really scary, but don't worry, everything reverted back to normal, and it turned out not to be a big deal? Whereas, you know, if you, like, 1984 ends and you're like, how long does this go on? All right.
Yeah, I mean, it didn't detract for me because 200 or 300 years, that's the entire sort of age of the country in which you're talking from. You know, that's a long span of time. It's long enough that okay, it can be in the cultural memory, but it's a long time. A lot happens in 200 to 300 years. So yeah, things flip in cycles, and we're often talking these days about how we're swinging so far this way, it's going to, the pendulum will swing back again. But when you sort of drill down into those ideas, you are looking in terms of decades-long cycles, or 50-year-long cycles, and you know that's getting on for a human lifetime. And so yeah, it does have a span of time that makes one quite disquiet. You know, it's not like, oh yeah, the kids will be okay. They won't be. They will suffer as well.
Yeah, I like what you said about the difference between those two types of writing, and it made me think of Fahrenheit 451, which I read in book club here, and how incredibly detailed he was about so many things. And I found that interesting, and I found that amazing and impressive. But I felt the same as you did. I hear, Alex, when I hear you bring up those points, I'm like, oh yeah, that doesn't make sense. That doesn't make sense. But when I was reading the book, it didn't impact me. And so thank you for ruining the book for me, because now that's all I can think about. I'm just kidding. I do feel like I still enjoyed it. And I think what Eric just said is really was my take, which was I wasn't as concerned about how everything came to be, but more concerned about the death of humanity in the instance that these things happen. And they keep happening over and over. And she did a good job of tying it to the nature of humanity, which is a warning against us coming to a place like this over and over and over again. And the real question for me is, what is it about human nature that keeps pulling us in this direction? Because we have places like that exist today. We have places like that existed throughout the 20th century. We have people within our own nation that are hell-bent on doing some of those same things, whether or not they know it. So that was my take as far as what the purpose of what she was saying was. And I really didn't get caught up in too many of the how it came to happen details.
There's a part I think you're right, Thomas, that what I like about it maybe is that it is speaking to like what human nature, what is it about humans that allows us to keep going along these kind of historical events. Why can't we prevent them from happening? What is it about us that's complicit? And there's even some parts of this where I think she shows great insight into human nature and our capacity for good and evil. Where she's talking about, for example, when they're in the rec center or whatever it is, when they're getting their handmaid training and they're going through this ritual where Janine is on the floor talking about her abortion and being gang raped. And she's sobbing and crying because the aunts are saying, whose fault is it? It was your fault. And all the handmaids have to say it was your fault. And she says even though she knows what's being done to Janine, she despises her for a moment. And she doesn't want to be her. And then she regrets that. This human feeling of looking down on this person. And there's a couple of moments like that where I think she's sort of telling you something about human nature. And I like that about it.
Yeah. And we've on the Wednesday night shows, we talk a lot I listen to a lot of these stuff about reason and the human capacity for reason, which is what makes us human, separates us from the animal kingdom. And she even touches on that. She talks about making distinctions between objects to maintain sanity. So she's going through the garden, and she's thinking about the garden, thinking about the red of the tulips, and looking at the red on the masked face of the man who was hanging on the wall. And she specifically talks about the way I keep my sanity is through making distinctions between a lot of these little things. So in some way, Margaret Atwood is speaking out against what woke is today, which is a denial of reason and a denial of objective reality. So I start to see her feminism as that old Camille Paglia type feminism, where I'm like, oh yeah, you know what, I'm on board with that. And I don't know what she's doing these days, or Margaret Atwood's doing these days, because I keep hearing about some of the stuff that she's talking about. But this book is over and over and over again, it's anti-woke.
She brings up the human capacity or need even to consider people as it, like in several times, like in the scene when they bring the guy in after the 3 women are hanging, and with no evidence at all, they just say this guy was accused of rape, and all the handmaids get up and kick him to death. Like, and she says, like, everybody has converted from thinking of that person as him to an it. Like, that's a necessary step to get to that point. And then the mob just piles on, and perfectly, what you think is a perfectly nice woman who's a handmaid starts kicking him in the head until he's dead.
They would do that to Kyle Rittenhouse in a second. Here's white supremacists. You know, they would do that to Kavanaugh in a second. Today,
They actually
kicked
did
him
try.
though, because to save
They
him,
did.
right? That good one kicked him to save that you're talking about, right?
Mora, was that?
No, the handmaiden that Keith is talking about of Warren or whatever, not of Warren, or
of Glenn.
like of Glenn. She kicked him.
Glenn.
She kicked him to save him. She
Right.
tried to kill him quickly so that he wouldn't have to.
Right, but
So
everyone else, like,
everyone else was the
and they would do that to some of these people if they could do it, if it was legal, if the government said, "Here's Kavanaugh, he's a rapist," they'd be like in there, jumping on him, like.
Yeah, and she
That is actually what they did to Kyle.
Right.
It's exactly that.
Right.
She even talks a little bit about what we call cancel culture today. I remember she says, it's no excuse that what they did was legal at the time. Their crimes are retroactive. They have committed atrocities and must be made into examples for the rest. So all these things that people are making excuses for and utilizing as their cultural milieu, she's actually speaking out against all throughout this book.
I like the little nuggets in these dystopian novels, like the one I put on Facebook, Keri, about that was when they suspended the Constitution. They said it would be temporary, which you read that now and you're like, why would that even be acceptable? There wasn't even any rioting in the streets. People stayed home at night watching television, looking for some direction. There wasn't even an enemy you could put your finger on. And that's the kind of stuff I read that I'm like, hello?
Oh, that's different. It's
That's
different.
the thing, though, that the problem is that there would be some protesting, because at the beginning of the lockdowns last year, there were people protesting them.
Right, but they silenced them
immediately
and censor you.
But she said that everybody stayed home. That's impossible. You cannot get 100% of the people to go, yeah, sure, I'm fine with that. Like, no, we didn't even get that done last year.
I think she means for the most part. I mean, that's the way I talk about this past year and a half. We didn't do shit. Yeah, there were people. I went to a couple protests, but we didn't. We collectively, we let it happen. We're still in lockdowns in some places.
She reads like a sheep.
Right. We as a people.
You know.
And she does mention later that there are protests that that some of the people went to that then they quit going because men with guns would show up and shoot them all. So, but that's the way I read that. I don't read that means literally like nobody tried to protest this. I just think it means we didn't as a society. And I think that's the same with lockdowns. We didn't. And with mask mandates, we didn't. And now with the vaccine.
Keri. Over here in the UK, I mean, there are protests with thousands and thousands and thousands of people. I've seen drone footage flying over them. It's not thousands, it's millions of people. This is massive streets in the centre of London with drone footage flying over them. It would take several minutes for it to fly over. It's not even covered in the mainstream media at all. It doesn't even touch. So, you know, you can protest as much as you like, but if no one can see the protest, it doesn't happen.
So maybe the handmaid just didn't see the protesting.
Or she didn't want to see the protesting.
That's amazing, Matt, because I have no idea that that's happening.
It's happening right across Europe as well. I mean, there are some alt media streams that are showing protests against the vaccine passports in France and Italy, and there is zero coverage over here of that. I don't know if you're seeing anything over in the States, but none of the mainstream media is covering it at all. But it is tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people just all out on the streets, and they're actually showing satellite footage from a different time to say, no, nothing to see here, nothing's going on. And they've been caught in the act, like people comparing drone footage that they've taken that is timestamped to what has been put out on by the mainstream press.
It's
I have been
minimally
hearing-
covered here and not in the mainstream. You might see a video on Twitter, but I hear more about it from people I know. Like, that's interesting. I didn't know about the London one. I know in Austria there's huge protests going on, same kind of thing when they just did their lockdown. But the reason I know is because I have a family member that used to live there, and her neighbor sent her a video. Like, that's how you find that out. Not seeing it on the news.
Yeah, my sister lives in Australia now, and I'm telling her that people are being shot protesting with rubber bullets in Melbourne, and she's like, no, that's not happening. Like, people are posting this. I'm looking at the videos. These aren't like radicals. These are sort of mums and grands, you know, with eyes that are bruised beyond and showing their backs with like this big welts and they're holding up the rubber bullets as well, you know, and these are just off people's Facebook streams, though if you try and find them, it's deleted.
Wow.
Let's do some super chats. Keri, do you want to read some super chats?
The chat. If my video breaks up, Carter, you just take over. Eric O'Sullivan. Hello, Eric. He says, hey, all, just wanted to support this channel. Read Atwood's Oryx and Crake trilogy. Sheesh. Want your socks scared off of you post-pandemic? It's got the goods. Thanks, Keri and Carter. Actually, I have not read that one. That one came out when I kind of went off Atwood for a while. And so I'm enjoying having reread this one. I'm like, I'm going to get back into it. Thank you. Somebody else recommended that one to me recently. TPS says the US is going this far in ideology with the fear of woke, self-censorship, government required training. That's a good point. Do you want to get the rest, Carter?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about that comment. Yeah, they're not quite as far as this yet, but I guess they're headed that direction. Another one, the next one from TPS also. I did a film legend analysis with the result that men physically fight because of women/children. Women physically fight up until they have kids. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I do think... I think when men have kids, generally, they do start to consider they can't be as reckless. So I think they're probably less likely to fight when they think that there's another option. But they're more likely to stand their ground when they believe that there is no other option. Right? So, yeah. All right, that's it for Super Chats. Any other comments on the book? Is there anything that anyone wants to say about it that you haven't said or haven't heard anyone say yet?
I don't think anyone's going to be making memes that say make Atwood fiction again, like Orwell. Like it's,
yeah.
I don't think that.
I kind of want to watch the series now just to see how different it is.
So the first season isn't so bad because they mostly stick to the book. They change a few things, but they do slip in little things here and there to let you know kind of that they're interpreting this as the lens through which we can view Trumpism and the right, which is ridiculous.
So the commander is orange? Is that their interpretation?
They also, they're trying to paint a narrative that it's the 1619 Project narrative. It's all those narratives they're selling us that the US is an oppressive white supremacist heteropatriarchy that hates gay people and hates women and hates Muslims and people of color, and that if Republicans have their way, it's very much a partisan. It's this tribalist thing that we're always given this false dichotomy in the media now. It's like, you got to go with the Democrats who are the good guys or the Republicans who are the bad guys, and it's that simplistic, and that's just bullshit.
Yeah,
and they also paint. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, there's no politics in this, really, from the sense of two parties fighting and arguing. Like, there's only one party. It's like Orwell's 1984. There's one party. So there's no politics in it at all. If I watch a TV show and it was, all the men had Magda hats on and that's what it was about, and the Democrats were fighting, and we're like, no, you're making all that up.
Yeah.
I'm curious.
Yeah, there wasn't even a political resistance talked about at the beginning. Even it was like, she talks about the government as one homogenous glop.
So did anybody?
She didn't even
Alex
resist.
read? Oh, sorry. I was just curious. Anybody besides Alex read the Testaments? Is it worth reading? Keri, did you read the Testaments? Well, Alex, you didn't think this was worth reading. So.
The Testaments is new. It's
How
something
new?
She wrote recently. I never read it.
2019.
Yeah,
What?
it's very new. Yeah, I haven't read it.
It's even less worth it.
Yeah, see, Atwood now, what's happened to her, I think, is that. So I think your interpretation, Thomas, this is very anti-woke in my opinion. Even though it's feminist, it's not woke feminist yet. It's not feminism as having been incorporated into the Borg, the woke Borg. And she's still anti-censorship. She's like a classical liberal in a lot of ways. It's like, hey, be you're going to get what you want if you're pushing censorship and book burning and kind of an orthodoxy. And I think you can't easily classify her as being woke by reading this. I mean, actually, I think it's anti-woke. But now she's living in this world where her book is being celebrated by the woke. It's been co-opted by the woke. And she's gotten into hot water several times by coming out and defending male professors who've had Me Too allegations launched against them with no evidence and who've been mobbed and canceled. She's come out against cancel culture. She wrote a piece of not angels or devils. Like, we're just like men. That's the whole point of feminism, was like to be treated equally, not to be treated better than or less than. And that's what I used to think. I thought that's what feminism was about too. And so I read that resonates with me, because that's what I think she's starting to see, the excesses of the woke movement. However, most recently, she got into hot water yet again with the woke by tweeting out an article that was critical of the cult-like nature of trans ideology. And when she got into her with the movement, because they want her, she was kind of crappy on Twitter. She kind of threw J.K. Rowling under the bus to save herself, and sort of like, I'm not a TERF. Here's a TERF. It's like, oh, come on, man. Like, that goes against everything. I don't know. She's like one of those people online right now where I don't know which way she's going to go. But
it sounds like she threw Moira under the bus there.
Yeah, that's a good point. Through Moira. And so, Alex, I trust you. I have not wanted to read the Testament because I was like, oh, she wrote that since the TV show, and she's probably moving more in that woke direction. Who knows? She's influenced by the popularity of it,
I think it actually damages The Handmaid's Tale quite a bit, because your understanding is that the place of The Handmaid's Tale lasts longer, right? It lasts a while. Like, this is the beginning, but it lasts a while. It doesn't. According to the Testaments, it doesn't last very long at all. So it's it makes it a little silly at that point, even more so for anyone who thought that the historical thing kind of took the bite out of it. It makes it even less biting, less terrifying, because you're like, well, then it hardly lasted any time at all. And it really, really brings home the idea that Atwood cannot vary her language for her characters, because she jumps through 3 different characters throughout that novel. So it's way more obvious there.
Okay, can I make this is where we're going to find common ground, Alex. So I love all of her old stuff. and I tried to continue reading her, but I quit reading her right around the time of Blind Assassin. And it felt to me sort of like how I love Tori Amos and I used to listen to every album. But after, oh gosh, what was that one? There was one she did where I was like, I can't keep up. I can't do this anymore. You're not growing. And I had to stop with Tori for a while, and I had to stop with Margaret Atwood for a while. And you're making me think maybe I shouldn't pick it back up. Although I heard Oryx and Crake is good, but
I'm a strong believer in like reading people's work in order of their publication, because you can kind of see their growth, and then when they stagnate, when they stagnate, level off. Yeah. And almost every writer does. If they're writing for more than 10 years, they can't help themselves, especially the literary ones. Like first novels tend to suck, which is understandable. It's your first outing. Second ones are sometimes sophomoric. But then when you get around 3 and 4, they start getting a stride, and then they just kind of like, after 10 years, they're kind of just, and it's hard. It's hard to keep that up because as a reader, because you were like, I loved this. There were so many gems, especially like if their first novels will be rough, but there'll be something like exciting and new about it. That's why it got published. But and then they smooth out their edges as a writer, and then they just sort of like, it's like they're doing it on autopilot essentially. And it
sounds like Metallica.
Yeah, that happens. I think all kinds of, you can get to that place where you get stagnant. Yeah. And
trying to replicate.
Yeah.
A lot of musicians do that, or they try and do the Madonna thing where they try and keep up and changing, but they actually suck at they're really good at their original style was really good, but they try and adapt it to capture Gen Z or millennials, and it's like actually you suck at that. So there's two paths they seem to go. Like either they stagnate or they try and keep with the times and suck. Do you know any writers who have kind of, Alex, can you think of anyone who kept it up and kept being fresh and interesting and kept going?
I can't really think of anyone. Really, like no one comes to mind as someone who was good their entire career, honestly. I can say that of a director. I feel like David Lynch was good for his entire career, but he also stopped making movies. Yeah. And he was like, I think I'm done. And I think that was probably the smartest move he could have made. But, like I really can't think of any writers, because for one thing, most artists can't stop themselves. They will keep going until they die. They cannot help themselves. I get it. I'm one too. I'm probably never gonna stop. This isn't just, it's like breathing to you. You have to keep going. So I get it, but you're probably gonna get tired at some point.
I actually give Margaret Atwood a lot more books than you do. Since this is about her book, I'll say I have her. She's good for for nine books before she went stale for me. So get into her earlier stuff if you liked this one.
Is this her early stuff? What is this? Where does this fall in the Atwood
Was this like 2 or 3? Edible Woman was first, I think. I think this might have been her second one or third one.
Are they different, or is it all kind of the same thing?
Surfacing was first. It's all themes of it's a lot of female protagonists, and it's a lot of this kind of inside the head, very poetic writing. And there are these themes that what Carter's going to call you look at some and say, oh, it's got feminism in it. But I think you would still like some of it. I think Surfacing and Edible Woman both came before this one.
Let's do.
I'm just guessing, but
go ahead, Keith. Sorry. I was
just going to say I would have assumed that the other books would be pretty similar, and that I read this one, so I already got Margaret Atwood. I don't need to read any more of her books. Like I already understand her thing, and a lot of authors do that. Not all, but kind of like Alex said, they hit the plateau. It's hard to be creative, and it isn't the kind of science fiction or dystopia that I like. Somebody brought it up earlier, like kind of hard versus soft science fiction and development of the plot. One of the books we read earlier in book club was the Moon is a Harsh Mistress, where he really lays out everything. Like he includes like how does stuff get to the moon and why did they do this, and like I like that because it makes it real to me. I like science fiction writers like David Brin. He's got a PhD in physics. Like, that's a good background to write science fiction. I don't like Tolkien. Margaret Atwood's more like Tolkien. Like it's not as realistic, and I don't enjoy it as much.
That's what I was thinking
That
of when I
Heinlein's-
mentioned that it wasn't 451, it was Moon is a Harsh Mistress. Sorry, go ahead, Brian.
But Heinlein's telephone still had wires, even though they were on the moon. You know, he got that specific, and that's what dated it so much for me. It's like, oh no, we need to connect the wires again so we can talk to people.
Yeah.
They didn't have cell phones.
Yeah, you have
He's a
to leave
technical
enough
background. I
things
think he's an
blurry.
engineer.
Yeah, but there's danger doing that, right? As I think is being pointed out, right? There's danger there because it's you inevitably get something wrong with tech, and then if you do too much tech in there, it dates it so much that you can't read it, and it makes it hard later because it's like it's like I watch Die Hard every year at Christmas, and my daughter's like, why don't they just have doesn't everyone have a cell phone? Like why? Like it's like the entire plot falls apart with cell phones. Like there's plenty of things that now granted that's not science fiction, so you can kind of rewind and put yourself in that headspace. But when science fiction gets it wrong like that, sometimes it is sometimes hard to read. So I get although I love Moon as a Harsh Mistress. So
Hey, there's a couple more chats. And just to clarify for anyone listening, to a correction. So this book, Alex pointed out, this is her 6th or 7th book. The Edible Woman, then Surfacing, then Lady Oracle, which Alex says she likes. Bodily Harm, Life Before Man, Bodily Harm, then The Handmaid's Tale. And there's a few more after that that are pretty good.
Let's do a super chat
Don
from Don
B
B.
says, yeah.
Go ahead, Keri, if you want to.
This book is actually pro sanctity of life, marriage, and motherhood. Even the wokeness of the show proves those truths. Thank you, Dawn.
Yep. All right, I think that's it for super chats. Is there anything else before we call it a day? Is there any other comments, thoughts, or points anyone wants to make about the book?
The biggest thing I took from the book was it's almost like a cry to her lost child. That was the most important thing that I took from it. I think all of the other stuff was important and whatever, but there was one quote I wanted to squeeze in if I may. I've been obliterated for her. I'm only a shadow now, far back behind the glib, shiny surface of this photograph. The shadow of a shadow, as dead mothers become. You can see it in her eyes. I am not there. And when I was making notes, I just put, that's possibly the saddest sentence I've ever heard.
Yeah.
That was my take on it.
Yeah, having children, I remember reading that part, and that was not fun to read. But she did her job.
Which is one thing I appreciate about her feminism is that it's a pro-mom feminism, which is not ubiquitous.
Yeah, I think the fact that at an hour and a half we're feeling a little bit like, okay, that's about all there was to the book. It reminds me that even though I did enjoy it, and the reasons I did enjoy it were because, and I'm starting to think now in part that it gives me a bit of a better perspective on some of the culture wars, to where, as I mentioned before, the general meme about this is, oh, look, you know what, read this book. It's going to tell you that men are trying to take over the lives of women. And when I read it, it was like, no, that's not really what's happening. It's a lot like any other dystopian novels. And I think she did a great job of looking at human nature, and I enjoyed the writing. But there's not a whole lot that I have left over where I'm really thinking about a lot of stuff. I think a lot of movies or a lot of books afterwards, when I read them, I can't stop thinking, or it makes me want to write about something or discuss something. Like I'm reading Eric Neumann now, The Origins of Consciousness, and I can't go more than 5 pages without stopping and staring off into space because my mind is just. I think once I'm done with this book, it'll be like, oh, that's cool. I'm glad I read that and I enjoyed it, but that was it.
I think she did a good job showing how miserable everyone was. Like everyone, the wives were probably the most miserable creatures. And the husbands, you know, even though they had their secret parties, just miserable and doubly feeling trapped maybe by their own lie and all those self-imposed rules, but just the fact that they were completely lying to themselves about all of it. So it's that double trap I thought was captured very well. And another thing that I don't know why I noticed that, but the what they chose, I think, as a tool to prevent communication between the women. You know, of course, their attire altogether, you know, just kind of puritanical and all that. But the bonnets, it's not a sign of modesty. It's just to prevent your visibility, your communication. They were completely tunnel vision. I really that kind of I don't know, just made me that was terrifying to think about, not being able to see, not being able to know and read the facial cues of other people and just your surroundings. You're completely feeling unsafe everywhere. It just reminds me of all the masking too. Like I feel like I can't see, not only read, you know, facial expressions, but I can't see. It's just something that kind of made me think of.
Yeah, I think you brought up an interesting point there with, you know, not being able to see. And one thing I've learned recently is one of the main ways we communicate is with eyes, which separates us from the chimps. So if you ever see chimps, their eyes are totally black. You can't see the whites of their eyes. And one of the reasons we have the whites of our eyes visible is so other human beings can see what it is we're looking at. So there's a communicative process that goes on there. So I remember when I heard that and I was during reading this, I was thinking, oh, that's a big part of it, because once they have this going on, they not only just facial expressions, but they can't even communicate with each other just using their eyes.
Yeah. All right, well, let's wrap it up then. Thanks everyone for joining. Yeah, have a good rest of the weekend. And as a reminder, the next book is Thomas Sowell's, what is it?
I have
Black Rednecks and White Liberals. Yes.
Black Rednecks and White Liberals.
Thank you.
We were hoping you guys would do another gratitude episode before Thanksgiving.
You know, I was thinking about that today. I didn't realize Thanksgiving was next week. And I thought maybe I'll reach out to Keri and ask her what she wants to do for it, because I don't actually want to do a... Yeah, I'm not... I didn't realize, do we have a coffee break scheduled? We'll talk about it later. But yeah, we should probably do something like that because I enjoyed it.
On the gratitude thing, since Amy happens to be here, Amy gave me this Golden Girls cookbook. And I haven't had to cook anything from it yet, but I have been reading it and making notes. Thank you, Amy.
We have one more super chat. Okay. Yeah, we have one more super chat before we go. I'll Fight You Naked said, it works the same way within Islam. The older women socially enforce the repression of younger women. I think that works that way in every social group. Like that works. That's not unique to this book. She did notice it, and I'm glad she called it out and was explicit about it. But I think she's right. That's often how it works. You have to get a member of the group to be the person controlling the rest of the people. So, all right.
Look at all the white woke people who try to control the other white people and the women. You know what I mean? It's like, yeah, it's the same. Sorry.
Yeah.
I know you're
allies. No, that's cool. All right. So have a good rest of the day, everyone. And we will see you for Kofefi break on Monday, which is tomorrow. And I guess that's it. Beverly, you can roll the credits. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
Thanks for watching. If you're new to the channel, we have a deep content library that includes interviews with everyone from Mike Cernovich to Megan Murphy. So go check it out. If you'd like to see more, please consider supporting the show by visiting unsafespace.com/donate. You can find us on all the major social media platforms, at least for now. And you can find a community of like-minded individuals on our Unsafe Space chat on Telegram. See you there.
Warning. This is an unsafe space. Dangerous ideas have been detected. The content of this production has not been authorized by the Cathedral. Pay no attention to it. To be honest, I am running out of patience with the following individuals. Here's a fun fact. Experts agree that inflation is good for you. As a reminder, self-defense can only be used as a last resort. You are legally required to first see if your death effectively deters your attacker. If you think about it, no one should be allowed to express opinions. But don't. Think about it, I mean. That's not your job. Thinking has been scientifically proven to be less efficient than compliance. Science, scientific, and scientifically are registered trademarks of the World Economic Forum. Unauthorized use is prohibited. Computer voice courtesy. Never mind, that last line is fake news. Please disregard it and return to your safe space immediately. There will be cake.